Picture yourself standing on the banks of the Nile, the sun blazing down, the air heavy with the scent of lotus flowers and secrets older than the pyramids themselves. You're not here for the golden treasures or the tales of pharaohs that fill every history book. No, you're stepping into a world that's been hidden from you. A world so shocking it was buried by those who couldn't face its truth. Welcome to WTF History, where we tear away the polished veneer of the past and dive into the raw, unfiltered reality. Today, we're diving into ancient Egypt, not the Egypt of glittering masks and grand monuments, but a place where sexuality was a cosmic force, a divine mandate, and a weapon of power. From 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, along these fertile riverbanks, the Egyptians built a civilization that wove intimacy into their religion, politics, and survival in ways that would make your blood run cold. This isn't just history. It's a nightmare that was real for thousands of years. So grab a seat, because what you're about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about one of the greatest civilizations ever. Imagine you're a royal embalmer in a dimly lit chamber. The flickering torchlight casting shadows that seem to whisper secrets. Before you lies the pharaoh's wife, her body still on a marble slab, her beauty frozen in death. But this isn't a routine mummification. The orders you've received defy every sacred tradition you've sworn to uphold, and the reason behind them sends a chill through your bones. This wasn't a one-off horror story. It was daily life in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods, their every act believed to control the Nile's floods, the harvest bounty, and the very survival of their people. Their sexual performance was no private matter. It was a public spectacle, a proof of divine potency that held the universe in balance. This belief drove the Egyptians to create practices so extreme they'd shock even the most open-minded among us today. The Egyptians saw sexual energy as cosmic energy, a force that could commune with the gods, ensure fertility, and maintain order in the universe. Every intimate act was a potential ritual, every position a form of prayer, every orgasm a conversation with the divine. It sounds wild, almost mystical, but this wasn't about personal pleasure or spiritual enlightenment. It was about control over the gods, the land, carved into temple walls, written in papyrus scrolls, and buried in the tombs of pharaohs and nobles. But here's the kicker. When 19th century archaeologists uncovered this evidence, they didn't just blush, they panicked. They smashed statues, burned documents, and locked away anything that hinted at the truth. Why? Because Victorian sensibilities couldn't handle a civilization that treated sexuality as sacred and all-consuming. Let's talk about what they found, because this isn't some wild theory spun for clicks. Temple inscriptions hidden from tourists depict acts that would make modern audiences flinch. Papyrus scrolls, too explicit for museum displays, describe rituals that blend worship and intimacy in ways that defy comprehension. And then there are the mummies that tell a story more disturbing than any horror tale. In 1925, Howard Carter's team examined Tutankhamun's mummy and discovered something that shook Egyptology to its core. His genitals weren't damaged or decayed. They were gone, surgically removed with a physician's precision. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, made shortly after death as part of the mummification process. And Tut wasn't alone. Others subjected to bizarre procedures involving foreign materials. One discovery stopped researchers in their tracks: the mummy of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. His body revealed not just missing genitals, but evidence that the removal happened while he was still alive. Medical analysis showed no signs of punishment or accident. This was a deliberate religious act meant to make him more perfect for the afterlife. The Egyptians believed the body, especially its sexual aspects, was a vessel for divine purpose. Modifying it, even in death, ensured spiritual function in the next world. But if they were doing this to the dead, what were they doing to the living? The answer lies in a system where sexuality was a weapon of power. Pharaohs faced immense pressure to prove their divine potency through public displays, often involving multiple partners in choreographed rituals before priests, nobles, or entire crowds. Failure meant disaster, not just for them, but for the entire kingdom. A drought, a bad harvest, a military loss, all could be blamed on a ruler's lack of virility, driving them to push boundaries further to prove their godhood through increasingly shocking acts. Nobles and priests weren't exempt. They competed to demonstrate their worthiness through sexual and religious devotion, their performances a kind of divine resume. But the real cost was borne by those at the bottom, children and slaves, whose bodies were treated as tools for divine and political ends. Their lives were shaped by a belief that saw no separation between the sacred and the profane, where abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was mandated. The scale of this system was staggering, woven into every level of society, from the pharaoh's palace to the humblest village. It wasn't hidden, it was celebrated, codified, justified by a religion that saw sexuality as the key to cosmic order. And when things went wrong, when the gods seemed angry, the practices only grew more extreme, pulling Egypt deeper into a cycle of desperation and devotion. This obsession with divine sexuality didn't just stop at the elite. It reached into the lives of the most vulnerable, shaping their existence in ways that are hard to stomach. Imagine being a child in ancient Egypt, born into an elite family or a temple household. You're not raised to dream or play. You're raised to serve. From as young as 6 or 7, children were dedicated to temple service, their lives no longer their own. These weren't just any kids. They were often the youngest sons and daughters of nobles, offered as tributes to the gods. The temples weren't sanctuaries of peace. They were training grounds for a brutal form of worship. These children were taught that their bodies belonged to the divine, that their purpose was to channel cosmic energy through acts most of us can't even fathom. The training was relentless, and methods to prolong arousal during hours-long ceremonies. They were conditioned to dissociate, to see their bodies as instruments rather than their own. Their bodies pushed beyond natural limits to meet the demands of their roles. Poor nutrition was deliberate, designed to keep them small and childlike, a quality prized by the adults who used them. Many developed infections or internal injuries from premature sexual activity, and the mortality rates were heartbreaking. Some texts suggest up to 60% of these temple children didn't survive past adolescence, their bodies broken by the physical toll of their duties. And this wasn't limited to temples. Wealthy families treated their domestic slaves, especially children, as commodities for pleasure. Legal documents are chillingly blunt, detailing the sale of child slaves for sexual purposes. Their value based on age, appearance, and training. A 7-year-old girl with pleasing features could fetch a higher price than a grown man, a detail that hits like a punch to the gut. The psychological scars were just as deep. Survivors who made it to adulthood carried trauma that modern psychologists would recognize as severe PTSD. They struggled to form relationships. Many died young, unable to cope with a world that had robbed them of their childhood. And the worst part? This wasn't seen as abuse. It was sacred, even when they knew what awaited their sons and daughters. The belief that these acts pleased the gods justified everything, turning victims into offerings and predators into holy men. This system wasn't just a collection of cruel acts. It was an industry fueled by economics and power. The trade in child slaves was thriving, with wealthy patrons paying premium prices for access. Archaeological digs have uncovered temple records listing payments for sacred services, contracts specifying the use of children, even specialized chambers designed for these acts. One excavation in Thebes revealed a room with restraints built into the walls, a detail so disturbing it was left out of public reports for decades. This wasn't a dark secret. It was a cornerstone of Egyptian society, supported by everyone from priests to pharaohs. When the Nile failed to flood or harvests were poor, the pressure to appease the gods intensified, pushing these practices to new extremes. The pharaohs, nobles, and priests doubled down, believing that only more devotion, more sacrifice, could restore cosmic balance. Picture an Egyptian city, say, Thebes, buzzing with anticipation. The air is thick with the smell of beer, incense, and something primal. Months before the festival begins, temple priests are brewing vats of beer, but this isn't your average brew. They're lacing it with psychoactive substances, lotus flowers, mandrake, maybe even opium derivatives, creating a concoction that doesn't just get you drunk, it sends you into another dimension. Participants didn't drink to loosen up. The lioness goddess who nearly wiped out humanity in a drunken, bloodthirsty rage. The gods tricked her into drinking beer dyed red to look like blood, and she passed out, transforming into the gentler Hathor. This festival was a reenactment of that myth, a surrender to divine chaos that lasted 7 days and nights. When the festival began, every social rule vanished. Masters slept with slaves in the streets. Married women left their families to join roving bands of revelers. Children were exposed to explicit acts and often forced to participate. The entire civilization turned into a chaotic, intoxicated mob, storming through cities, breaking into homes, and dragging people into the madness. Ancient texts describe scenes that sound like dystopian horror. Groups of drunken Egyptians attacked each other in a sexual frenzy, biting, scratching, and leaving wounds they believed were marks of divine favor. Some died from internal injuries caused by violent acts. Others were trampled in crowded streets. Priests didn't just condone this, they preached it. Every act, no matter how brutal, was holy. Abuse was communion. Violence was a sacred offering. Even child abuse was framed as a divine blessing. Foreign visitors were horrified. Mesopotamian diplomats called the Egyptians barbarians, hiding behind a veneer of sophistication. Some kingdoms refused to send ambassadors during the festival, fearing for their safety or moral contamination. The aftermath was as brutal as the event itself. Many participants woke up with no memory of what they'd done, only to find evidence of their actions. Wounds, broken families, ruined lives. Children born 9 months later faced stigma as divine offspring, marked by the chaos of their conception. The economic toll was massive. Cities shut down for a week, agriculture stalled, trade stopped, and government functions ground to a halt. Yet the pharaohs saw it as a necessary cost, a way to maintain cosmic balance and release social tensions in a tightly controlled hierarchy. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Temple sites reveal chambers designed for group sexual activities, with features suggesting violent and degrading acts. One site in Karnak uncovered a room with stone benches and restraints, a detail so disturbing it was omitted from early reports. Citizens could defy authority, but only within the festival's boundaries. It was a safety valve for a society built on rigid hierarchy and divine extremism. But this extremism couldn't last forever. With their love of rationalism and restraint, were horrified by what they saw. Imagine Ptolemy, stepping into a temple, watching priests orchestrate acts that would have been unthinkable in Athens. The Ptolemies had to play by Egyptian rules to keep their subjects happy, participating in temple rituals and festivals, but their sensibilities were at odds with Egypt's mystic chaos. Cleopatra I, one of the early Ptolemaic queens, tried to reform the Feast of Drunkenness, shortening its duration and banning the most violent acts. It seemed like a reasonable move, but to Egyptian priests, it was blasphemy. They argued that altering sacred rituals would anger the gods, bringing floods, famines, or military defeats. When disaster struck, they had their proof, doubling down on tradition. Fast forward to Cleopatra VII, the one we all know. She faced an impossible task: keep the Egyptian priests happy while satisfying the Romans, who were now casting a shadow over Egypt. The Romans saw Egyptian practices as barbaric, proof of a decadent civilization. Cleopatra tried a cultural tightrope act, hosting private festivals for Egyptian elites to keep the old rituals alive while presenting a sanitized version to the Romans. It was a compromise that pleased no one, pushing the abuse of child slaves underground, conducted in secret chambers to avoid Roman scrutiny. Text describing acts he couldn't comprehend. His response was brutal: destroy the evidence. Temples were stripped of carvings, papyri were burned. But you can't wipe out 3,000 years of culture overnight. The children raised in this system faced a tragic fate. Many, conditioned for sexual service, couldn't adapt to a world where their purpose was gone. Roman records describe former temple children dying by suicide, unable to find meaning. Others formed underground cults, caught between their ancient beliefs and a new world that rejected them. But the real cover-up came centuries later, when Victorian archaeologists stumbled onto this history and couldn't handle it. Picture Giovanni Belzoni in 1817, standing in the tomb of Seti I, his torch illuminating explicit wall paintings. His response? Cover them with plaster. Auguste Mariette kept private collections of explicit artifacts, locked away from public view. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo had restricted rooms accessible only to male scholars. The Ebers Papyrus. Archaeologist Flinders Petrie admitted to burning papyri and smashing statues he deemed too obscene. Universities refused to fund research into Egyptian sexuality, and academic journals rejected papers on the topic. The British Museum has over 2,800 artifacts labeled as miscellaneous pottery to hide their true nature. Even today, museums like the Louvre and the Met keep explicit artifacts in storage, accessible only to researchers who navigate bureaucratic hoops and sign confidentiality agreements. This cover-up wasn't just about Victorian prudishness. It was about control. By sanitizing Egypt's history, scholars created a version of the past that fit their worldview. Sexuality wasn't a footnote in ancient Egypt. It was the heartbeat of their culture, shaping their religion, politics, and social order. For 3,000 years, the children caught in this system faced horrors we can barely comprehend, their lives broken by a society that saw their suffering as divine will. This story challenges us to look at our own beliefs, to question what we justify in the name of faith or power. It's a reminder that history isn't just artifacts and dates. It's the story of people, their beliefs, and the systems they built. For better or worse, Egypt's sexual practices were born from a desperate need to control the uncontrollable, the Nile, the gods, the future. But in that desperation, They lost the humanity of the most vulnerable. Here at WTF History, we dig into these truths not to glorify the past, but to understand it, to learn from it, and to give voice to those histories silenced. If this journey has left you as shaken as it's left me, click the video on your screen to dive into another buried truth. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and stay curious.